Archibald!
Excuse me, sir. Something rather interesting has just cropped up. Listen to that. Music. Civilian broadcasting. I think those fellas in the Pentagon have given us some sort of exercise to test our readiness. Personally, I think it's taking things a bit too far. Our fellas will be inside Russian radar cover in about 20 minutes. You listen to that. Chock-a-block full of stations, all churning it out.
Mandrake?
Yes, sir?
I thought I issued instructions for all radios on this base to be impounded.
Well, you did indeed, sir, and I was in the process of impounding this very wide when I happened to switch it on. I thought to myself, our fellows hitting Russian radar cover in 20 minutes, dropping all that stuff. I'd better tell you, because if they do, it'll cause a bit of a stink, huh?
Sir, Captain, the officer exchange program does not give you any special prerogatives to question my orders.
Well, I realize that, sir, but I thought you'd be rather pleased to hear the news. You know, after all, well, let's face it, we don't want to start a nuclear war unless we really have to, do we?
Please sit down and turn that thing off.
Yes, sir. What about the plane, sir? Surely we must issue the recall code immediately.
Group Captain, the planes are not going to be recalled. My attack orders have been issued and the orders stand.
Well, if you'll excuse me saying so, sir, that would be, to my way of thinking, rather an odd way of looking at it. You see, if a Russian attack was in progress, we would certainly not be hearing civilian broadcasting.
Are you certain of that, Mandrake?
No, that's what it bothered of mine, that's me.
And what if it is true?
Well, I'm afraid I'm still not with you, sir, because, I mean, if a Russian attack was not in progress, then your use of Plan R, in fact, your order to the entire wing, yeah. Well, I would say, sir, that there was something dreadfully wrong somewhere.
Now, why don't you just take it easy, Group Captain? And please make me a drink of grain alcohol and rainwater and help yourself to whatever you'd like.
General Ripper, sir, as an officer in Her Majesty's Air Force, it is my clear duty, under the present circumstances, to issue the recall code upon my own authority and bring back the wing. If you'll excuse me, sir. I'm afraid, sir, I must ask you for the key and the recall code. Have you got them handy, sir?
I told you to take it easy, Group Captain. There's nothing anybody can do about this thing now. I'm the only person who knows the three-letter code group.
Then I must insist, sir, that you give them to me. Do I take it, sir, that you're threatening a brother officer with a gun?
Mandrake, I suppose it never occurred to you that while we're chatting here so enjoyably, a decision is being made by the President and the Joint Chiefs in the war room at the Pentagon. And when they realize there is no possibility of recalling the wing, there will be only one course of action open. Total commitment. Mandrake, do you recall what Clemenceau once said about war?
No, I didn't think I do, sir, no.
He said war was too important to be left to the generals. When he said that, 50 years ago, he might have been right. But today, war is too important to be left to politicians. They have neither the time, the training, nor the inclination for strategic thought. I can no longer sit back and allow communist infiltration, communist indoctrination, communist subversion, and the international communist conspiracy to sap and impurify all of our precious bodily fluids.
Yeah, that's right. These being the dialogue in Doctor Strangelove between General Ripper and I believe it's Major Flight Captain Mandrake, right? Who cares? The British are like irrelevant at this point. And back in the 1960s, same thing. But regardless, returning to the matter at hand. Welcome back. It's General Lance. Obviously Sergeant Barnes here in the background brooding as always. And we're back at it with Caesar Imperator. Here I have left off, and if you haven't previously listened to the other transmissions, please do so. We have just gotten to the point where Caesar has made his case to his command, the 13th Legion, has secured, or rather just affirmed their loyalty to him and the support that he has amongst them, and has decided once and for all what he must do. It is at this point that the Pompeian faction have completely extrajudiciously, judicially? See, I'm above grammar. Like the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, I'm above men and grammar. But regardless, going back here, so ultimately they have taken power. They are already in control of the state apparatus. This is called state capture. And so Caesar is put into this dilemma, right? Political decision game dilemma. If he does not go and force himself while he still has the means, that is a military at his disposal to impose his, or rather to enforce his political rights, and not to be at the whims of a charlatan in Rome who are obviously partisan against him, who at this point obviously have a semblance of legitimacy, even though it's the case that it's a very weak coalition composed of a plurality of the elite, a semblance of the middle classes, and of course he has no pull amongst the people themselves. But regardless, he's arrayed against this enemy who's entrenched, who have this mechanism of state against him, and if he does nothing, he's left with two options. The first option, to relinquish his command, to remand his person and himself to the authority of the Senate, to arrive in Rome, and ultimately take his case to the courts, or to deliberation in the Senate House. At this time, Caesar is already a proconsul. He was going through his command. He already had a number of different years under service. The popularity amongst the people and a large segment of the aristocracy was pretty pronounced. On top of everything else, of course, he had the understanding and the growing divide and rivalry between himself and the Pompeian faction. And he understood that any kind of conflict, or rather if he went through the legitimate, quote-unquote, legitimate channels, or the conventional channels of disputing his legal rights in the Senate House, he would have been found guilty, tried, and executed, much in the way of the conspiracy of Cinna. And not to be confused with Sulla. These are two different things, but the point that I'm trying to make here is that he would have set himself down a road in which he had no other option but to take up arms, if he wanted to live, of course, and fight and liberate Rome from this plutocratic elite that were perverting justice and had complete control of the state apparatus. So, ultimately, he has those two options, right? Second option being to use the military force. the command that he had instilled and the loyalty that he has both within his troops and within the Roman polity at large. Rome at this time is not just one homogeneous, let's say, centralized state, much in the vein of an absolutist France or whatever bureaucratic top-down state. It's very much feudal, for as much as Rome is central, all the little cities that were colonized, or Latin colonies, veteran colonies, or Latin, let's say, allied cities, all had their own curia, they all had their own deliberative body, they all had their own garrisons, they all had their kind of political elites, and so on. And so the image that you should have in your mind is something approximating feudalism, but rather it's almost like a whole patchwork or network of city-states, all nominally or explicitly under the control of Rome, but who have a large practical de facto level of political autonomy within their specific areas in which they have some kind of, let's say, control. And so the political arena and the Gallic Wars, which he had just gone over the Alps, subjugated all of Gaul, and had made sure to create propaganda, right? What we call propaganda, but really is just kind of retelling of his glories to make sure that he, as a general, was in fact someone that was noteworthy, that it also buttressed his political strength, and prior to his, let's say, expedition to Gaul, it had been a mutually reinforcing thing during the First Triumvirate, which, recap, was an alliance between himself, Crassus, and Pompey. But now Crassus had literally drank gold against the Persians. Pompey found that he didn't have the same kind of popularity. His acuity at political maneuvering was abysmal, and so ultimately threw in his lot with the Senate and the aristocracy. For instance, Cato the Younger, I believe, and Cicero, and so on. Yet, the majority of the people were on Caesar's side. This is a dynamic that's incredibly important, and Clausewitz always makes the case that all forms of warfare always have the citizen body, the political body, as the center of gravity in which you're trying to capture or completely destroy its will to resist. Now, Caesar, his aim was to co-opt or win them over, and so win that center of gravity. The Pompeians, in a rearguard action, politically speaking, understood this, could not counter it themselves, for Crassus is already dead. Pompey, his victories are now old, they're already in the distant past. His triumphs, having gone through Rome already, are long since vague memory, and Caesar is this kind of almost superhuman overman figure who has won massive campaigns and glories and brought riches and wealth to the city, and triumphs and basically trophies of every kind from Gaul for an extended period of time, which, remember, the Gallic Wars lasted something like 10 or so years, give or take. And so the Pompeian faction, or the Optimates, what they were trying to do is ultimately hoping that Caesar would balk, that the legions being raised up in the Italian proper peninsula would overwhelm the, though veteran, small in number, numerically inferior force of Caesar himself. They did not take into account, or rather when they had the political calculus of those allied city-states that populate all throughout Latium, they thought to themselves that they had a lot of support, they had the legitimacy of the Senate, and therefore they commanded the respect and the loyalty of those allies. And so they felt as though, from a very top-down way, that Caesar would have fallen across or fallen against Rome, or the Senate, like a wave against a cliff. But as we're about to see, and in the course of events leading past the Rubicon, we'll come to understand that it is not so. And that ultimately what happened was, it was a giant whose feet were made of clay. The Optimates, of course. Now, this is a lot of reiterating what I had said previously on the previous transmission. Now, going forward, the 13th manfully marches across the Rubicon and enters the pages of history. And quickly he comes across the city of Ariminum. This city is one of the first stops on the way en route to Rome. And if you don't have a map of Italy, you have to remember the Rubicon is on the eastern coast of Rome. So he's basically doing a diagonal. If you think the center of Italy is basically a big box, he's at the top right corner and he's cutting across the Alps, or excuse me, he's cutting across the mountain range in the middle. The name of the mountain range escapes me. But then cuts across and then heads down to Rome. It's obviously en route. There will be many cities, and this is the first one. Quickly, the Roman host, the Caesarian host, comes to the city gates. Already ahead of the host, there's a number of representatives who speak with the consul and the Senate that is of that city. So not the Senate of Rome, the Senate of Ariminum, right? Because it's just like here in the United States, every state has their own state senate, which is in the same kind of mold as the national federal senate. And so he speaks with the representatives, and the case of the Caesarians is made to the Senate body as well as that of the Pompeians, and the Ariminums throw in their lot with Caesar. And in no small way either, because they throw out not just the messenger and the representative of Pompey, but the garrison as well, so they eject them, and they throw open their doors to Caesar. This is met with absolute shock from Rome, from the Optimates, because they assumed that the Romans would be loyal to them, because they had the legitimate body of Rome, and they felt as though Caesar was an outlaw, and the same way that they felt about Caesar, they thought that the people would as well, and the various other allies. And so they go into a frenzy, and this crazy kind of negotiations start. And the first initial negotiations begin because they are starting to see, and as Caesar progresses from city to city to city, that they're all doing the same thing. On top of everything else, of course, a number of their legions that are at first loyal to Pompey go over to Caesar, especially many of the centurions and the rank and file. So, what they do is they approach Caesar, and I'll have the quote right here. What the initial offer was the following. They, Pompey's faction, consulted about the matter and responded, sending Caesar through these same men, and this is of course at Ariminum, a written proposal that contained the following points. Caesar should return to Gaul, leave Ariminum, and dismiss his armies. If he did all this, Pompey would go to Spain. In the meantime, until binding assurance was given that Caesar would not do as he had promised, the consuls in Pompey would not suspend their recruiting. So, in other words, this is already a non-starter, but this is the beginning of a political negotiation. Similarities and parallels exist in the now, and I'll get to that in a moment. But, for the meantime, this places Caesar still at a disadvantage, because what is going to happen to his person is that he's still going to be tried in absentia. He still has no representative that would have any real means of making his case before a court that is clearly partisan to his enemies. And so what this would mean is that Caesar would be in Gaul, he would have no army, and that he would have to take it on faith that Pompey would go to Spain with his legions, and that the Senate would play ball with him. So, okay, no, I'm not going to do that. Of course not. That's absurd, because they could always do it in bad faith, right? They could always make it a ruse de guerre, and just simply induce him out of necessarily, let's say, patriotic sentiment, because they had all lived through the initial civil wars between Sulla and Marius, and so they felt maybe there was some kind of sentiment of Caesar that he didn't want to bring that kind of bloodshed to Rome, the heart of the Roman Republic. But if you look at it objectively, regardless of sentiment, this just can't float. It's not working. And on top of everything else, they're starting to see the edifice, the foundation of their support, crumble before their eyes. And so Caesar continues down the road, and he comes across many cities, and much the same thing happens everywhere he comes across. And those fresh legions, which, mind you, remember, Pompey is in the process of raising fresh legions. He is conducting levies, he's doing initial training, he has a numerical superiority on paper. But remember, those paper numbers are not weighed the same as the veteran legions of the growing 13th Legion. The 13th has been through multiple campaigns, is bloodied and tried, and has incredible cohesion, experience, battlefield experience, grown men who have been through many battles. They have a lot of basically veteran troops. And so every time they meet with in a small skirmish or some kind of small tactical exchange between the Roman host and the Pompeians are absolutely annihilated, to say nothing, of course, of the individuals who turn tail and run, who desert on sight, who switch over to the Caesarian faction. And so there's growing and growing alarm, until finally, of course, they get to the point where they get to Rome, and in the hurry, in the flurry of things, the Senate realizes, okay, we don't have a meaningful military ability to resist the Caesarian faction. We need to buy time. And so they conduct an operational withdrawal at a certain point, but this is going too far, and this is going to be the subject of the next transmission. Suffice it to say, the thing that I wanted to focus on is the following. Once you have a Rubicon dilemma, right? Once you have a Rubicon moment, all you can do is pull the trigger. Because once you cross the Rubicon and you stay in the river and you wade to your knees, it's always going to result in defeat for you. Because let's think about it rationally from the other perspective. If Caesar had stayed and he had acquiesced at every turn, every decision, he would have had to take it on faith that the Senate would have acted in faith, when they clearly haven't been for the last few years, calling him a war criminal and blah blah blah, and basically extrajudicially or judicially, I can't even hack that word, gosh darn, but anyway, basically underhandedly capturing the state, and so forcing the decision upon Caesar. And at no point in the decision tree for him would it have made sense for him to actually back down. And so Caesar did the right thing in marching on Rome. This has salience, and part of the, let's say, the audio clip that I played for you from Dr. Strangelove, a similar situation played out, in which General Ripper presented a Rubicon moment for the United States in this hypothetical fictional setting in which he starts a nuclear war to destroy the communists, and that ultimately he basically ordered a wing. Just to give you background, he orders the wing that he's in command of to do a tactical nuclear strike. He presents a fait accompli to the DoD, right, the Pentagon, and the Pentagon is left unawares. They realize that this is what they have, and so they understand, okay, like, this is, we're stuck in this dilemma. And he basically does the decision tree in which, if he forces the hand of the Department of Defense, I don't even like calling it the Department of Defense, it's the Department of War, okay? Absurd. Department of War, we've got to change it back. But anyway, as I was saying, this would have been a Rubicon moment, and had the Americans in this, let's say, hypothetical, in this world, understood what was right, they should have conducted a full strike, okay? Instead of trying to sweep up General Ripper, as the story played out, try to call the Soviet premier and basically the Politburo of the Soviet Union to basically make them aware of the situation, to shoot down American planes over the Soviet Union. And ultimately what happened in the story is that there's a doomsday device, and that if there's one tactical, nuke that goes off, that this thing goes off, and so the whole world like dies, and it's all propaganda, right? So you have to understand, Pinko Hollywood, Red Hollywood, is always going to portray these generals, patriotic people, good people, as evil, as absurd, but they're not, okay? Who you're cast as a villain is actually the hero, and who's the hero is actually an incredible villain, especially the president of the United States in this time, who's some kind of pinko and peace lover or whatever, tree hugger, whatever. Long story short, what I'm trying to get at here is this: is that is the correct understanding of a Rubicon situation. You're supposed to follow through, and in real life, a similar situation happened. Now, I don't have any side on the Ukraine-Russian war, but we're going to look at this from an objective point of view. We're going to talk about the Prigozhin, well, what we thought was going to be a coup, but it was a 3-day event in which he actually did not. He presented the Moscow, Putin, a Rubicon dilemma. So basically Prigozhin chose to cross the Rubicon, and the reasons are kind of unclear. From what I understand, it has to do with collegial competition between departments and department heads, between himself as a representative of the Wagner Group and the MOD, which is the Ministry of Defense, and that ultimately this kind of continued attacks and rivalry culminated in the Wagner Group being completely cut off from military supply, and so was causing immense casualties to his person. His influence was declining, his ability to secure political advancement was declining, and so it seemed like he was a falling star. And so what he chose to do was to go to Moscow, ostensibly to confront I think the Ministry of Defense is, Shoigu. I don't know. Long story short, his claim was that he was going to lead a divisional-sized force, much in the way that Caesar only had 1 legion compared to, I think it was 5 or 6 of the legions that were under the Senate's command, the Optimate's command, and strike right at the heart of Moscow. Many people in the West, at the time that it was happening, I remember when it was happening, I was keeping up with events, were thinking this was the end of Putin, this was going to be the moment in which, there's going to be basically coup d'etat, blah blah blah, a la Caesar. But what happened was that Lukashenko, the president or premier, whatever you call him, of Belarus, negotiated as a conduit, as a middleman between Putin and Prigozhin. And ultimately, after a number of small skirmishes that broke out between Wagner and the Russian military itself, Prigozhin decided to stop the column. Okay? He decided to stop. And that what ended up happening was he stopped, everything was okay, Wagner was dissolved, negotiations went down, and for 2 weeks or so, basically what happened was Wagner was completely dissolved. The rank and file and officers of Wagner, the minor officers, were given carte blanche. They were forgiven, and they were forgiven forever. Like, nothing happened to them. I think they were given like either severance or enrollment in the actual Russian military. Prigozhin and Dmitry Utkin, these 2 principal leaders of Wagner, were given asylum in Belarusia. 2 weeks later, however, and everything seemed fine, right? 2 weeks later, however, these 2 men were on a small flight on the way to Moscow, and it got shot down by Russian air defense. And I think the official claim is that nobody really knows, or it was some kind of accident, but you and I both know Putin whacked that dude, right? Let's be real here. So ultimately, this is a real life scenario of a Rubicon moment that it's if you don't go all the way, you ultimately lose and you fail, because every outcome after that, that seal of trust, especially between preeminent commanders, is just absolutely broken. That fracture is just not healable, and so without, of course, a complete dominance of this character. And so in this dynamic, Prigozhin made the wrong decision in the Rubicon moment. If he were to actually threaten with a division-sized force, I mean, it was literally 15,000 men, tanks, APCs, truly fully mechanized force with veteran soldiers, like absolutely balls to the wall, capable of doing what they're doing. They had a lot of domestic support, and they were on the route to Moscow, and they stopped something short of like 30 kilometers away from Moscow. It was something crazy. It was a hair-raising situation. And then ultimately what ended up happening is that I suppose, from what I understand, is that Prigozhin, or what's alleged, Prigozhin is some kind of Russian nationalist. He didn't want to completely dissolve the Russian Federation, because that's what would have ended up happening. Had he been successful in taking Moscow, a general civil war would have ensued. Not simply the war effort in Ukraine would have failed, but also I think the country itself would have fallen apart. The internal republics would have declared independence, insurgents everywhere would find opportunity, there would be a lot of, basically Western support for any kind of liberal revolutionaries, communist revolutionaries, whatever it may be, to ultimately dissolve and break apart Russia. This failed. And the reason why I believe it comes to sentiment, but it also comes to the fact that the FSB and a number of security services knew where the families of these preeminent men were, probably would have liquidated them too. Remember, politics is always like this, right? Politics is not just a life or death scenario for yourself, but everyone around you, your friends, and your family. And so these are the things that are coming in the calculus of the political actors at this time. It's never an easy decision. It's not something you do on a whim. You can't be cavalier, because ultimately the consequences are dire. And even if you are successful, who's to say that his family would have survived? They could have easily been just liquidated on the spot. And so the reason why I kind of talk about this is because ultimately a lot of people chicken out. They get cold feet, and they don't actually do the thing they're threatening to do. What's worse is that people don't understand is once you threaten, or once you even make posturing towards this end, it's already the dice are rolled. There is no going back. Even if you get to a negotiated settlement, it will always end in your demise, just as it would have ended for Caesar, just as it did end for Prigozhin. Does this make sense, Legionaries? I'm going to keep this nice and short because I think it's important. But once you've made the decision to do the campaign, to make that effort, to kind of do this kind of palace coup, so to speak, coup de main, or coup de grace, you have to go all the way through. Because at no point in the decision tree cycle are you ever going to be allowed to survive a negotiated settlement, especially as someone who is perpetrating a Rubicon moment. Remember, in tandem with these transmissions, I'm going to be writing it in more detail, more fully, explanation. I have it all written down. As soon as I publish the book, y'all can look and see the extant details and kind of more in detail all this stuff. But I wanted this to be a supplemental transmission, just so that way you can understand the greater lesson here. But as I like saying before, I like keeping it short, I like keeping it sweet and to the point. So at the end of this, when we're examining Caesar's march on Rome and examining the Rubicon moment itself, remember, if you cross the Rubicon, don't go back over. It's do or die. It's victory or death. Without further ado, this was Caesar Imperator, This is General Lance, Sergeant Barnes, signing off.